And I will switch to English now to introduce Martin Elek to you. He's read musicology at the Franz Liszt Music Academy in Budapest and is currently a PhD student at the University of Cambridge under another very important, very prominent figure of performance research, John Rink. And he is going to talk about his work, his project on large-scale form in musical performance. Martin, it's great to have you. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen with you. I hope you can see it. And yep, perfect. Yeah, so hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. In the next half hour, I'm going to be talking about the question of large-scale form in a musical performance. First, I will outline the conceptual basis of my approach. Then I will present some of the techniques of analysis and representation that are currently in use. And finally, I will discuss the potential benefits of broadening the range of techniques with the qualitative method, namely intensity curves. Recent years have witnessed a surge in studies dedicated to the question of large-scale form in musical performance. That is, the creation or inflection of forms by the musicians during performance. This subject has now been addressed by a broad range of articles, dissertations, and research projects, a list to which my own doctoral research may be added. Before presenting the analytical techniques that are relevant to this field of study, we need to establish the theoretical basis of our investigation. Specifically, we need to introduce three dichotomies that underlie any approach to musical form. The first of these dichotomies revolves around the question whether musical structure is regarded as an immanent entity, which is inherent in the score, or rather as something that is created in and through performance. I will be referring to these as immanent structure and created structure respectively. First, let's take a look at the former notion. According to the concept of the immanent structure, a piece's form is a singular, unchanging entity which is created by the composer only and is reflected in the score. The performer's role is to understand this structure and project it in performance. So this is the traditional perspective that underlies much of 20th century writings on music, especially those of music theorists. For example, this is reflected in the analytical literature on form and performance, including the books by Erwin Stein, Edward T. Cohn, and Wallace Berry. The concept, however, is not without problems. For instance, it takes no account of the creative role of performers, since it relies on the score-based notion of predetermined and unchanging musical meaning. It is no wonder then that the notion came under heavy criticism following the so-called performative turn in music studies. Gradually, a new concept of musical form has emerged, which I will call the created structure. This approach takes into consideration the role that performers and listeners play in the creation and inference of structural understandings, as a result of which form is now considered to be pluralistic, something that is created each time anew in the process of performing and listening. It follows, therefore, that form must be variable, since its understanding will differ from musician to musician and from listener to listener. Early formulations of this notion, including that by Hermann Goczewski, appeared in the 1990s. However, its most developed theorization comes from a 2015 article by John Rink. In this study, Rink identifies a number of principles that underpin this new notion of form. First, affordance. Quote, musical materials do not in themselves constitute structures, they afford the inference of structural relationships, end of quote. Second, inference. Quote, inference of this kind will be individually and uniquely carried out whenever it is attempted, even if shared criteria result in commonalities between the discrete structural representations, end of quote. Third, multiplicity. Quote, musical structure should therefore be seen as constructed, not immanent, as pluralistic, not singular, end of quote. And fourth, time dependency. Quote, furthermore, because of music's time dependency, musical structure should be understood first and foremost as a process, not as architecture, especially in relation to performance, end of quote. Since it represents a more productive and ecologically valid approach, I will adopt this notion in my investigation. The last point about time dependency leads us to our next dichotomy, the one between synchronic or synoptic form and diachronic or processual form. The terms synchronic and diachronic are borrowed from linguistics, where they refer to the language as a system existing at a given moment and language as an entity constantly changing through time, respectively. In musical context, synchronic form refers to a spatial representation of the form of a whole piece viewed simultaneously, while diachronic form denotes the processual unfolding of the piece in time. On the slide, you can see some of the terms with which these approaches are customarily characterized. Following the performative turn, scholars have been promoting a diachronic notion of form, since that reflects the reality of the performing and listening experience more accurately than synchronicity, which has been associated with score-based analytic principles. However, this distinction is not as clear-cut as it may first seem. Analysts from Schenker to Berry incorporated diachronic elements into their work, while advocates of the performative approach too make use of synchronicity, at least in their representational techniques. The main criticism leveled against synchronicity is that it could lead to such score-based understandings of form that disregard the processual nature of performance and the reality of the listening experience. However, it would be a mistake to push aside synchronic form as irrelevant, since it is in this manner that we can comprehend the forms of whole pieces, as the following writers argue. Rudolf Arnheim, for instance, claims that, quote, in order to comprehend an event as a whole, one must view it in simultaneity, and that means spatially and visually, end of quote. Karl Dahlhaus expressed a similar notion by writing, and please excuse my German pronunciation, sofern Musik Form ist, erreicht sie, paradox ausgedrückt, ihr eigentliches Dasein gerade in dem Moment, in dem sie vergangen ist. Und in der Distanz konstituiert sie sich als überblickbare plastische Form, end of quote. Finally, Anna Jorens, who otherwise promotes a diachronic notion of form, acknowledges that, quote, musical form is experienced diachronically and interpreted not only prospectively, but also retrospectively. However, our global understanding thereof implies a sort of analytical synchronism, end of quote. In any case, in order to avoid the pitfalls of a purely synchronic approach, we could focus our analytic endeavors on diachronically emerging forms, which then could be represented synchronically. At the heart of these two dichotomies lie a general issue: if and how musical form can be perceived while listening to a performance. Throughout much of the 20th century, theoretical writings have been dominated by the idea of structural hearing, that is, the presumed supremacy of hearing large-scale, synchronically conceived compositional structures. However, in recent decades, a string of empirical studies has questioned the ecological validity of such notions, calling into question, for example, the role that tonal unity plays in the perceived cohesiveness of performances. These examinations have led some, including Daniel Leach Wilkinson and Andrew M. Friedman, to question the very validity of the notion of large-scale structure as anything other than a purely compositional device, which has negligible, if any, relevance for performers and listeners, at least in its traditional formulation. Unfortunately, we have no definitive answer to the question whether and how listeners perceive large-scale forms. What we have instead is a number of theories, such as the generative theory or the theory of cues and imprints, which, however, have only limited empirical basis. Nevertheless, a lack of definitive results is not a reason to ignore this pivotal question, and this is why, in my own research, I adopt a listener-centered approach. That is, I consider oral perceptibility, based on, in this case, my own perception, a criterion in discussing large-scale formal shaping in performance. The three issues that we have just discussed, that is immanent structure or created structure, synchronicity or diachronicity, and oral perception, represent critical factors that one should consider before evaluating analytical techniques and formulating conclusions. Consequently, in my own approach, I use the notion of created structure, a diachronically informed synchronicity, as well as oral perceptibility as the criteria for identifying structural elements in performance. Having established the theoretical basis of the analysis of form in performance, I now turn to the analytical techniques. Tempo and dynamic curves need no introduction. These are the most commonly used techniques in performance analysis, and for good reason. They are easily produced with the sonic visualizer, and the resulting graphs are informative and easy to read. The critique of tempo curves comes from Peter de Seine and Henk-Jan Honing, who argue that, quote, the notion of these tempo curves lulls its users into the false impression that a continuous concept of temporal flow has an independent existence. However, one cannot perceive timing without events carrying it, end of quote. A more general problem concerns not the technique itself, but our over-reliance on it. No individual method is sufficient in itself to represent the multifaceted experience of musical listening, or even to represent the experience of large-scale form. Therefore, it is problematic to single out one parameter to depict a whole musical performance. Duration is also used to analyze the performer's strategy to shape the large-scale structure. Although tables such as these could be useful for the researcher to gain a basic idea of the shaping of a piece, it is problematic to draw conclusions solely on the basis of durations. First of all, it is a synchronic technique, the relevance of which to listeners is questionable due to our event-based time perception. According to Robert E. Ornstein, for example, quote, the amount of information registered in consciousness would determine the duration experience of a particular interval, end of quote. A lesser-known technique is arch correlation plots. This method was developed by Craig Sapp and Nicholas Cook, and it is based on Neil Todd's phrase arch theory, according to which musicians segment pieces into hierarchically organized phrases by increasing the tempo and dynamics at the beginning of phrases and decreasing them at the end of phrases. According to Todd, the degree of these changes determines the hierarchical order of the phrase arches, which then can function simultaneously at different levels, for example, at the 4-bar, 8-bar, 16-bar, or 32-bar levels. By uploading tempo and dynamics data into a scapeplot generator, as we have seen before, which is freely available online, we can determine the degree to which a performance's timing and dynamic shaping conforms to the archetypal arch shape. The orange and blue flags that appear on the scape plot represent conformity with this arch shape. The orange flag depicts an increase in tempo and dynamics, while blue represents a decrease. Therefore, an orange flag and a blue flag together make up an arch shape. Furthermore, the height of the flags provides information regarding the hierarchical weight of the arches. By providing a representation of a piece's hierarchical segmentation, arch correlation plots can serve as a useful tool in the study of performed musical forms. However, the technique is not without problems. First of all, Todd's phrase arch theory is limited in its applicability mainly to pieces with short and symmetrical phrases and to performances after the Second World War, when phrase arching assumed a dominant position in the general performance style, as Cook established. Also, it is important to keep in mind that certain performance elements, such as phrase final decelerations, may be caused by factors unrelated to phrase arching, by fermatas, for instance. Another issue that may help explain the relative unpopularity of arch correlation plots is the difficulty of reading the images. Since only those intimate with the workings of the method can fully comprehend scale plots, its usefulness for a general readership is limited. By the way, the most detailed explanations of the technique can be found in these two publications that you see on the slide, as far as I know. A further technique that I would like to mention is SOM word clustering. This method is promoted by John Rink, Neto Spiro, and Nicholas Gold, and it is based on the hypothesis that recurring expressive patterns in timing, dynamics, articulation, timbre, and other performative parameters can potentially have motivic functions and therefore could play a role in creating large-scale structures. With the help of so-called SOMs, that is, self-organizing maps or coherent networks, and by using, for example, beat-level timing and dynamic data segmented into bars, we can identify timing and dynamic patterns in performances that could shed light on the formal strategies of performers. The graphs in the top left of the slide represent such patterns. In the second phase of the procedure, the software, which in this case was Discovery SO Mine, detects the distribution of these patterns across and within performances, the result of which can be seen in the other graphs. Similarly to the previously discussed techniques, SOM word clustering can cast light on the large-scale shaping of performances, but it needs to be used in conjunction with other methods. A shortcoming of SOM word clustering is that it works most effectively in pieces where the metrical structure is relatively stable, such as dance movements. Finally, I would like to present a useful method of depicting diachronic structures. Anna Jorens, in her dissertation on diachronic structures in performance, devised the following representational technique in order to, quote, globally represent the dynamic, processual perception of musical structure, end of quote. In the graphs, the green lines and arrows denote the senses of stillness and forward impulse, respectively. The arches above the bar numbers represent grouping units in performance, while the hairpins indicate the changing levels of intensity experienced by the listener. Jorens's representational technique can be very useful in incorporating diachronic elements into traditional synchronic representational methods. In the last portion of my paper, I will argue that employing qualitative techniques such as intensity curves would broaden and enrich our capabilities to represent musical form in performance. There is a long tradition of integrating the concept of intensity into notions of musical form by both theorists and performers. Erwin Stein, for example, explained that, quote, the musician should feel the groups of notes as latent forces. They are arranged in such a fashion that they create an impression of continually changing degrees of tension and relaxation, according to the affinity or disparity of the structural features, end of quote. Drawing on the energeticist analytical tradition, Wallace Berry argued that, quote, musical structure can be regarded as the confluence of shaped lines of element succession, which either agree, are complementary in intensity direction, or disagree, are mutually counteractive or compensatory in direction, end of quote. Discussions of tension in relation to form and the mental representation of pieces abound in the writings of musicians. Leonard Bernstein, for instance, claimed that the conductor must conquer the form of a piece, not only in the sense of form as a mold, but form in its deepest sense, knowing and controlling where the music relaxes, where it begins to accumulate tension, where the greatest tension is reached, where it must ease up to gather strength for the next lap, where it unloads that strength, end of quote. The conductor Donald Burrow explained in a similar vein that, quote, the central act of musical expression and interpretation lies in the performer's ability to adjust the energy elements of the tonal impulse in a way that enhances and reinforces the patterns of tension that are inherent part of every musical structure, end of quote. And it is not only theorists and performers who may think of music in terms of intensity. In a study conducted by Shu Lantan and Megan Kelly, participants were asked to listen to short orchestral pieces and, quote, try to get a sense of the composition as a whole and consider how best to represent it, end of quote. The majority of participants decided to draw images such as these. When asked about the dimensions depicted, participants named intensity as one of the aspects of the music that they tracked. We may ask then, what lies behind intensity's universality? One reason for this may be that the sense of intensity crosses and associates different modalities. Building on a large body of empirical research, Zohar Aitan and Roni Granot have established that listeners readily associate and perceive as similar analogous intensity changes in different musical parameters, such as pitch, dynamics, tempo, and textural density. They argued that, quote, it is an inborn tendency to perceive intensity as a holistic property over and beyond specific dimensions or even perceptual modalities, end of quote. And they also reflected on the implications of intensity for musical form, quote, listeners may identify structural functions of musical segments then by recognizing a typical intensity contour, an intensity contour that may be analogously depicted by diverse dimensions, end of quote. There is also a distinct tradition of drawing intensity curves by theorists to explain and visualize certain aspects of musical form. Let's take a look at some of these. One of the earliest depictions of an intensity curve comes from Hans Meersmann's 1923 article. Wallace Berry too employed one in his book, Structural Functions in Music. Similar images appear in Diane Lewis's dissertation, in which she tried to grasp the musical shape of pieces by drawing curves such as this. Although the graph refers to momentum, it is clear that Lewis used the term not in the sense of tempo, but to denote energy and intensity. Finally, John Rink used an intensity curve to demonstrate a method whereby a musician may grasp a piece's overall shape. He wrote, quote, an intensity curve, that is a graphic representation of the music's ebb and flow, its contour in time, determined by all active elements, harmony, melody, rhythm, dynamics, etc., working either independently or in sync or out of phase with one another to create the changing degrees of energy and thus the overall shape, end of quote. Let's now turn to the potential benefits of using intensity curves. Perhaps one of their main advantages is that they help overcome the parametric isolation that still dogs performance analyses. Instead of singling out individual aspects such as tempo or dynamics, intensity curves provide a more holistic representation of the listening experience. They are performer and listener-centered and therefore answer the call for more attention to the real-time activity of musicians and listeners. They help grasp the musical form in a manner that comes naturally to most consumers of music, and this also means that intensity curves fulfill the criterion of oral perceptibility. They are also intrinsically diachronic, since they emerge through the processual in-time experience of musical listening, and they therefore fit well with the diachronicity-based concept of musical form that we have been discussing. Another crucial advantage of intensity curves is that they provide an ideal vehicle for representing the plurality of the perceivable musical structures in a performance. As we have discussed before, musical form is best viewed as being created in performance and inferred variously by listeners. Since the experience of form varies from listener to listener and even from listening to listening, a flexible qualitative technique such as intensity curves is required. The subjective nature of drawing these curves therefore should not be seen as a drawback, but rather as an opportunity to grasp the no less subjective process of structural inference. They are also universally recognized. As we have seen, intensity curves are considered by analysts, performers, and listeners alike to be a useful and natural way of representing whole compositions and their forms. Finally, the simplicity of the image and its similarity to traditional representational methods like tempo curves mean that they are easily comprehensible. Naturally, intensity curves are not without drawbacks. First of all, intensity is subjective, meaning that it cannot be measured quantitatively or objectively, or at least not in the holistic way in which a listener perceives it. As I mentioned, however, this is not necessarily a problem, since musical listening itself is an inherently subjective exercise, and it is arguable that even the interpretation of objective data involves a certain degree of subjectivity, especially when one tries to draw musically meaningful conclusions. The second issue concerns the fact that it is impossible to decompose intensity curves into their constituting parts. Although some elements, such as tempo and dynamics, can indeed be visualized separately, it is true that not all of the constituent factors can be objectively quantified. However, I would argue that this stems from the elusiveness of the listening experience itself. It is true that our quantitative techniques are ill-fitted to reflect all aspects of a performance. Nevertheless, this does not mean that those aspects should be neglected. If we have a technique that can grasp the multifaceted experience of listening and of structural inference more than traditional methods can, we should not reject that purely on the basis that our quantitative techniques are incapable of explaining it. Also, it should be noted that intensity curves, just as every representational method, need to be accompanied by analytical commentary, which would inevitably shed light on the constituting elements. In conclusion, we have established that the technique of intensity curves fits well into the newly constructed notion of musical structure as created, diachronic, and orally perceptible shapes. It is my conviction that the benefits of this technique greatly outweigh its possible drawbacks, and that it offers a method whereby we get closer to grasping the multifaceted experience of musical listening. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Martin. Very fascinating talk. So now my microphone is in place. Very fascinating talk. Thank you so much. So many stimulating thoughts. I would have a few questions on my own, but maybe there are other comments, other questions from the auditorium. Yeah, Frithjof Vollmer.
Martin, thank you very much. Very interesting talk. I have one question for you. As you said, the intensity curve is not to be measured quantitatively. How exactly is it created then? What should I do to create an intensity curve? And the second question is, what does it say to us then?
Yeah. So, yeah, you're right. Like, we cannot objectively measure it. I mean, not as a holistic experience as we would listen it. Well, I would argue that a method whereby we can do this is listen to the piece and draw curves with our hands, just very simply, very basically. And although it may seem simplistic, but I would argue that actually that itself could tell us something about the formal experience as a listener perceives it more than some quantitative techniques could. So although it is not backed up necessarily by quantitative facts, it arguably reflects the listening experience of form more.
Excuse me, just a second question. Even though if maybe people from different musical cultures would completely curve this curve completely different?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that actually should be seen as an advantage, because structural listening or structural inference, as in the new concept of musical form that I've been discussing, means that no two listeners gonna experience the form the same way. So I ask, why should the representation of that form should be the very, very same? Of course, if 10 people come up with a very, very similar curve, then that means something. But it doesn't mean that it has to be the same, because even when I listen to a performance, and at one point I listen to the phrasing of the theme that always reappears, my formal understanding is gonna be different than if I focus on the large scale, I don't know, something else basically. So it varies from listener to listener, and even from listening to listening, and therefore it not should be the same. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I think.
Yeah, thank you. I just realized that I missed Johannes Henschel earlier, but again, as Julian Caskel said earlier, I took the power of being the host to one follow-up question, which you Martin and Frithjof just discussed. And that is the fact that there is no quantifiability, no way to quantify this intensity curves. But wouldn't there be an approach, and in fact it's a tested method in music psychology, of course, to get a group of people to do the same thing and then try to find some intersubjectivity principles in those intensity curves, in the perception of a certain piece of certain intensity principles in a way. Is that an approach that you follow, or what are your thoughts on those studies that are there already?
Yeah. I mean, those are, I think, absolutely fascinating, and that's definitely one way to approach it. My approach differs in a way that so I'm looking at performances in a kind of a holistic way, that I'm looking at these intensity curves, but at the same time I will be doing, as musicologists, other analytic techniques. At the same time, I will look at score-based analysis of the pieces. I will look at the written memoirs and written works by the performers themselves, which of course, arguably, that's something that a group of random subjects brought into a room just cannot produce. So I think both approaches are very, very valid. My own is that I take intensity curves alongside other analytical techniques and try to see how all these techniques bear on the listening experience, which of course will vary, as I said.
Yeah, thank you. Now Johannes Henschel.
Yeah, thank you for the very inspiring talk. I want to come back to the notion, or this what you introduced as a dichotomy between diachronicity and synchronicity. Yeah. For that very interesting perspective. I was wondering whether you could talk a bit more about how the two relate to each other, because in some sense they could be viewed as two sides of the same coin. I mean, if you have some sort of let's say architectural representation, you could always turn it into a video by scanning through it from the beginning to the end and have thus a more procedural representation, and the other way around. Could you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually an interesting point that you made, because some writers, for example, Edward T. Cohen, argues that what he calls synoptic listening and more processual listening are actually complementary ways of experiencing a work. So in that way, right, I think the dichotomy boils down to the question where we take score-based analyses of drawing architectures, and whether those are actually bear on the listening experience. So I think that's where it really, really boils down. And I use this quotation from Karl Dahlhaus, and in a later publication on Beethoven, he actually kind of turned it around a bit and promoted, okay, well, the result, which is the synchronic form, synoptic form, whatever you want to call it, is fine. But for a listener especially, the temporary structures that appear while listening, in the listening process. So basically, when you don't know what's happening, you have expectations, and you prospectively, retrospectively interpret the piece. That is also a valid approach, and not just valid approach, but a very important part of the whole thing, of the whole notion of musical form. So to get back to the main question, that I think it is a question of whether those, drawn architectures that we see in score-based analyses can actually be perceived as such by the listeners in the process of listening.
Yeah, thank you. Julian Caskel.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot also for the presentation. I think the interesting thing about intensity curves is that you can do it with a lot of things, not only with musical forms. So I also thought the first 10 minutes I was really concentrated in your presentation. Then I got a little tired, but then I was back on track and so on. So I could also draw an intensity curve of this one. So the question here would be, the question would be, where is the musical form within the intensity curve of that you draw? So my first question would be, can you say, if you draw these curves yourselves, is it more long-term structural harmony, or is it sudden entrances of instruments, or is it something like the main melody line? So do you notice where you get your information from the music? This would be the first point. And maybe just a second point, I think the psychological research on something like chills and goosebumps and something like that might be interesting here, because they also try to find a way how people react to musical forms. So for instance, Karel Krumhansel. And so second short question would be, do you consider this to be part of your project?
Yeah, let me just answer the second one, because that will be probably briefer. At this point, I don't, but it potentially can have a validity in this kind of analysis. So, in future project, absolutely, I would consider it. And to get back to your first question, so where is the form in these curves? Well, it's a question, what do you think form is? Because if you think form as, once again, as an architectural representation of piece, that there's an A section, B section, and a C section, and or draw a Schenkerian line or whatever, that's going to be different than to say, okay, so I think of form as the shape of a piece in the broadest sense of the term, which relates to the second part of your first question, which is, so what is what in that representation? And I think a very productive approach in this sense is to consider aspects of a performance having structural function if I, as a listener in the moment, think that that has structural function. So as you said, a harmonic turn can have structural function if I hear it a structural function. The melody line can have that. Certain, as you said, the like the string section, coming in when you don't expect it, that can have structural function. So I really operate with this very broad understanding of form and what can be termed as form. And so if I hear something as structural, as related to this shape, then that can be anything for the listener. And if I think, for example, if I listen to a work and if I have at the very end this synoptic form in my head, that for me sometimes takes a form of this intensity curve. So that is the form for me. Yeah, I don't know if it makes sense, but that's what I think.
Yeah, zwei kurze Fragen, two short questions from Christian Utz.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Martin.
Hi.
Great to learn some more details about your project. It's fascinating.
Thank you.
Well, two short questions. The first, you can answer it very quickly, maybe about the term. I'm not sure if intensity is the best term for what these curves actually describe.
Okay.
Intensity is used, as you know, as a technical term for loudness in acoustics. So maybe it's would be better to speak of tension. And we saw that the performers themselves, they speak of energy, and sometimes they might also speak of intensity, but well, that's just a simple point. And the other thing is whether you would have people, listeners, design these curves in real time and while listening, and then how do you synchronize with the music, or if you would allow them to, you know, redesign the curves in multiple listenings.
Yeah. So at this point in my research, I'm at the point where I will actually working out the exact methodology of how would that work for me, and of course, perhaps for later studies as well. I would imagine that both approaches have validity. So I think it's very useful as well to just, you know, put a pen in their hands or whatever, you know, technological form, and say, okay, so as the music goes along, you just do that and don't let it go, and do another version where they can actually revise that and come up with either like a revised version that reflects their synoptic understanding more. I think those are very, very useful techniques, and I would definitely explore both of them in my own work. That will, as I said, will kind of come later on now.
And how to synchronize with the music? Will you do it in a digital context or?
Yeah, well, probably I would try experimenting with those techniques, definitely, to try to come up with as an extra layer or super visualize something that I can use as part of an augmented listening, as you were referring to. I don't know yet how will that work really, if I just take a tempo curve that I draw like, you know, manually as if it were the intensity curve itself. But something like that I think can be very useful actually. Thank you.
Yeah, and 2-3 minutes left for a last question by Herman Goczewski.
Well, thank you very much for the very fascinating paper, and in many points I totally agree with your approach, and as you will see in my paper tomorrow. And one question is, when I think of my musical listening, many times I'm experienced various intensity or tension curves at the same time. For example, in polyphonic music, one voice increases tension and other voice decreases. And how do you deal with these polyphonic processes in music?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a question that needs to be addressed later on. In my own research, I am focusing on romantic and late romantic orchestral pieces, and especially the performances of those by Wilhelm Furtwängler, in which case this question of like, so I'm looking at like Beethoven symphonies, Brahms symphonies mainly, and in those pieces, the question of polyphony is like less important than say an actual like a Bach vocal piece. So it's definitely will be a question to address later on, but and it goes back to one of the disadvantages of the technique that I was referring to, that you cannot decompose it into separate parts. So, well, it's possible that there can be multiple intensity curves drawn for each dominant melodic lines or something, but that's definitely an interesting point and definitely something to consider later on for further applicability. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We just hit 1:15, at least here at my time zone in Austria. Are there any comments or questions left? Otherwise, I would transit to closing this section. Thank you again very much, Martin, and thank you also to Christian Utz and Thomas Glaser. We're going to have a longer break, a lunch break. I think we all deserve that really very much. We will continue in 1 hour and 50 minutes, 2:30 Central European time, with a presentation by Thomas Wozonig. As mentioned so many times, I would invite you to join the Wonder Room whenever you want, whenever you'd like to meet your colleagues, to maybe discuss certain things that came up in the last hours. And on the other hand, a second formal technical advice. Oh, sorry, I just sent it to. So now again, you find the list of registration for that event in the chat again. So just in case you haven't registered so far, just so that we can keep track of who attended our conference and who would like to be part of an email list, so that we can establish a constant forum